Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here with you today. I shared my screen. I want to be sure that you can see my screen, Lydia. Thank you. My name is Kэрol Kvirk, and I'm here with my colleague, Carolyn Teigland. And I'm very glad to be back at this conference again. I have presented here twice before in person, but very happy to be presenting to you today remotely. Carolyn and I are going to talk about inclusive classes and inclusive schools. Often in the US and in many countries, we have often thought about how to include an individual child and given a lot of very important thought into that process. We've learned that if we are going to include individual children well, then we really must think about how the classroom operates, and more importantly, how the school operates. So we want to begin by understanding what we mean by inclusion. And these are the things that we'll be covering: the inclusive classroom, inclusive school-wide practices, and how we understand what it feels like to be included from the point of view of a student. This is a visual that gives us the image of how we were educating children with disabilities long ago. On the left-hand side, you'll see all of the colored dots, which are children with different disabilities who are outside of the public education system. Across the globe, we have not included children with disabilities up until the last 20 to 50 years. The middle figure shows how we moved to try to bring children with disabilities into our schools. Often we might bring children of one kind of disability or children of disabilities as a class and put that classroom in a typical school. And so those children may be part of the whole school community, but they were not necessarily in the classes or lessons that every other children had. When we think about inclusion, we're thinking about all children who live in the vicinity or area of the school and having them attend the classroom and the grade level that they would normally go to if they did not have a disability. This brings challenges to teachers in how to collaborate and adapt the lesson so that the child with a disability can be a full member and learn in that different setting. So we begin by looking at the neighborhood where the child lives. And these are all the different places within the neighborhood: the places of work or employment, the places where we go to recreate, perhaps a gym to work out or a park, the marketplace, places where we go to a mall to shop, to a grocery store, or places of worship like a temple or a church. In all of these places, the only one that has a separate physical space often for children with disabilities are schools. And that's because it's taken us a long time to understand how to include children with disabilities in the same spaces. But that truly is what we mean when we talk about inclusion, is starting by having the child with a disability be in the same physical space as all other children. And then it's our job as adults to figure out how to modify the environment and modify the lesson, and how we can find time to collaborate together with specialists who know more about certain aspects of a particular disability. So beginning with the classroom, we'll first look at the quality of the grade level instruction. If the classroom teacher is teaching primarily by talking and having the students read books, we're not considering all of the other avenues for learning. And we know that for children who have disabilities or even children who are gifted, if we rely only on speaking and listening and reading, we are going to leave out many children who learn in a different kind of way. Teachers need to learn how to adapt lessons. Now, I can tell you, having worked for over 30 years on inclusive education in the United States, and even though we have been including children for at least 20 years in regular classes, our teachers are still struggling with how to adapt lessons. And one of the reasons is teacher preparation. Our universities are not keeping up with the programs and services in our public schools. So that may be something that you want to keep in mind. So adapting lessons is very critical, and usually it requires two people to work together. We also want classes where children are not sitting for the majority of the day, but have opportunity for movement, for working in cooperative groups, and changing the kinds of ways in which they're learning. I remember when I first came to Russia 10 years ago and showed images of children who were sitting on the floor, working in small groups. That was a surprise to many of the teachers. But when I came back just 2 years ago, I did see many classes that operated in very creative ways. So if we want our teachers to be able to teach to a wide range of learners, of children, then we need to change the way our education system and classrooms have functioned. Finally, the adults need to work together differently. A major challenge that we have had is having school administrators change their schedule so that teachers have time in the schedule to collaborate together. Often a master schedule for the school was designed so that there were times of day for different teaching of different subjects. But we also know we need more time for teachers to collaborate. And we may also need a time for students to be in different groups to get specialized instruction based on what they need. Not just children with disabilities, but any child who may be struggling. So here you will see some different children in different positions in their classroom. This girl over on the upper right, her name is Ashley. And this girl is actually in the school district where Carolyn works. She has a physical disability and she uses eye gaze to communicate on her iPad. Her iPad has a special program that reads where her eye is looking. This is her regular science teacher. And in this setting, the teacher had given a whole group instruction to all of the children and then had them work individually or pairs to follow through on an assignment. The teacher then went to the student to understand better how she was using the eye gaze, how long it took her to respond, and what she knew by way of answering questions. The special educator, similar to a tutor in Russia, she was in the classroom as well, but communicating with the other students about their work. On the bottom here, you see a little boy whose name is Jacob. He is in grade 2. In the lesson here, the children were sitting down and listening to the teacher, but he has autism and he uses earphones to block out some of the sound. And if he sat on the floor, he would be rolling around. So by giving him a chair, that was an accommodation so that he could pay attention to the lesson. Now, for these children over on the left, you may not see anything obvious about their abilities or disabilities. We have many children with what we call invisible disabilities, children who have reading disabilities, attention deficit disorder, or other neurological disabilities that affect their learning. We want all of these children to be included, which means the teachers need to understand how they can provide supports and other ways to help children participate in lessons and learn at their level. So there are some influences on inclusion that are very important for us to think about. And the first is the teacher beliefs about what students need in terms of learning. We see many times where a teacher will make an assumption about a child's intelligence based on their speaking ability, for example. And what we know is that many children with intellectual disability or autism may have a greater level of understanding than they're able to communicate verbally. So we want our teachers to have high expectations and strong beliefs about the importance of inclusion and offer them the highest level of instruction that they can. How teachers are assigned in terms of their roles and responsibilities is very important. When a special educator, and you may have defectologists or you may have tutors, and I know from our former discussions that in many rural areas, you don't have sufficient special education staff. But when you do have special educators, what is their role in the classroom? Are they expected to come in and work only with 1 or 2 children, or do they truly collaborate with the classroom teacher so that they are equal as a teacher in that class? And finally, the traditions of the school organization will affect how well educators can be inclusive. So how money is assigned in terms of considering funding for classroom teachers and funding for special educators. An important aspect is how we label students. I still go into schools in the United States and in other countries and hear people talk about students by their disability label, instead of calling them by their name or considering them a regular student first and a student who also receives special services. So I urge you to think about the language that you use in discussing students, when you talk about students, or when you talk to students. And finally, how decisions are made. I recently was in a secondary school in the US where the principal was discussing who should be included and who might be excluded. And they were giving preference to students who had less obvious or less significant support needs, and said that those students should be included first. And that is really not a fair way of looking at who gets to be included or not. And so we encourage our schools to think about everyone who would normally belong in your school. And if there's some reason the school cannot accommodate every single student, to think about all students by grade level to make it fair across grade and not discriminate by a particular disability. So finally, we're thinking about the reasons that we include children with disabilities. And those are the outcomes. And we know through research, there's research in Russia, there's a lot of research in European countries, as well as the research in the United States that tells us that when students with disabilities are included, not only are there academic benefits for those children, but there are also academic benefits to the other children. We believe that this is because the teachers begin to change the way they teach and enrich the instruction to the benefit of all children. We also know that social connections improve, especially for children who have more significant disabilities, children perhaps with Down syndrome or autism, children who have multiple disabilities. When they have opportunities with their peers who do not have disabilities, and the adults are modeling and encouraging positive interaction, those children with disabilities are much more likely to have friendships. And so now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Carolyn Teigland, who will talk about the school-wide practices that we need to consider.
Hello, I greatly appreciate everyone having me today to discuss the inclusive models that I've been involved with over the past 2 decades in my school district. School-wide practices are particularly important in establishing inclusive practices within a school. We have to be very deliberate and really think about what school-wide practices we are going to put into place prior to beginning inclusion. First and foremost, everyone on staff must have the mindset for inclusion and accept the idea of including students with disabilities in the classroom. It's very important for the leader to work with the staff to help them understand what this looks like, what their role will be, and how to accept and define what practice is going to look like in the school. As Carol stated earlier, the school needs to identify who is going to be included and who is not in the initial stages of the transition. Again, we strongly recommend looking at grade level rather than disability when making this school-wide decision, so that we're not marginalizing one particular disability over another. We also need to make certain that we're communicating with the families that are involved, that they understand what this will look like for their student, and that they understand what the schedule will look like and what their participation in the classroom will look like. Teachers need to be brought alongside of the administrative team in planning and scheduling for students that they're going to be receiving in their classrooms. The school administration needs to be very clear about the roles and responsibilities of all of the teachers involved in this process. And there needs to be a very deliberate plan that's developed by the team at the school, and that plan needs to be revisited often to ensure that it is achieving the goals that were set forth and that the students are meeting with success. First, I'm going to discuss the principal's role in an inclusive school. The role of the principal is critical. The principal must buy in completely to the idea of including students with disabilities in the classroom and in the school. They must have a very clear vision of what this is going to look like in the school and in the classroom, and they need to be able to communicate how this will look. They need to be able to communicate why it's important and why we're working hard to make this happen for all students. They need to distribute leadership among their staff. This cannot be a directive to the staff. It must be something that the staff collaborates alongside with the building leadership on. This is important so that when students are included in the classroom, this is done in a way that's deliberate and meaningful. The principal must empower collaboration, join teachers in conversations around these students, problem solve, and clearly identify any barriers that may be occurring, and acknowledge these barriers and work to develop a collaborative solution. The master schedule is very important for meaningful inclusion. We need to determine how we're going to divide students up in a way that will lead to good outcomes for students with and without disabilities. And then the principal must be able to come alongside teachers and coach them through difficult and challenging situations, model for them how this should look in their classroom, and give them support and training when necessary. When the principal describes their clear vision for what's going to occur and revisits it regularly, it's a matter of discussion that is ongoing and in the front at all times. It cannot get diluted or watered down by other initiatives. It really needs to be the primary focus for everyone. We need to recognize the barriers, as I said earlier, and acknowledge these. We cannot pretend that this is not hard work, because it is. It's very challenging for the teachers involved to come up with meaningful ways to educate all students, to accommodate the needs of all students, and to do that in a way that engages students in learning. The organizational structure within the building needs to be one that will achieve the vision. The classroom needs to be adequately staffed. The teachers need to be trained well in how to do this work, and there needs to be constant conversation about the challenges and potential solutions to problems that they are encountering. The school leadership, the principals, must acknowledge the hard work and time and effort that this takes. And they need to develop mechanisms or ways to build time in the schedule for teachers to plan, collaborate, and discuss student outcomes. Most of all, the principal of the building needs to be confident and positive and a model for the change process. As we collaborate with teachers, we also need to make certain that they're making good decisions about how to divide up students and make certain that the equality in the classroom is distributed, meaning that we don't have one classroom that has all students with disabilities and then just a few students without, that it's an even distribution across the classroom. The next slide will show you a photo of a way that we sometimes divide up students, and Carol is going to describe that a little bit more this time. You're muted, Carol.
The context for the discussion that Carolyn and I are having is that I have been working for about 30 years with school districts and with schools to help them do the work of inclusion. Carolyn just mentioned that it is hard work, and it's something that needs to be an ongoing process. The reason she knows that is because she has been a leader for about 30 years in a school system of about 25 schools, where she has led the effort for schools to become inclusive. I worked with Carolyn about 10 years ago, and at that time, they had about half of their children with disabilities in regular schools, in regular classes. Almost the majority, almost half of their children with disabilities were in separate classes in a separate school or part of a school. It took them at least 8 years to gradually bring in schools and very carefully make the kind of changes that are needed, including the teacher training, the encouragement that she discussed, and importantly, the leadership preparation, because the leader of the school, as we know, is the most influential on the practices within that building. This photo that we're showing you here shows how in one school, in one grade, the teachers distributed or assigned students to different classes. And this is a practice that inclusive schools are beginning to use more and more to be equitable, to share the responsibility and support needs across teachers. So one teacher doesn't have more or less supports to be provided than the others. In this case, this is a grade 4 team. There are 4 classes in the school building within that grade. So we have one teacher, another teacher's class, a third teacher's class, and a fourth teacher's class. The teachers and in the previous year, so if this is grade 4, the grade 3 teachers identify their students who need more. Some of them have disabilities and are qualified for special services. Some of them don't have a disability, but may only have a speech impairment. Some of them have some serious behavioral challenges that make it difficult for teachers. And they put their names of the students on a sticky note based on the color. So the students that are on the yellow notes are students who have disabilities. And they write a letter. They might write R for reading or B for behavior, and arrows that indicate high support need or low support need. The red sticky notes are students who have behavior supports. And you can see they definitely wanted to split those students up and not have them in the same room. The blue notes are not students who have disabilities, but they're students who are not performing at grade level. And rather than teach them in a separate class, we're also wanting to create heterogeneous classrooms, not homogeneous classrooms. So we're mixing children up together. And these are students who may need more support, maybe some small group work within the class or small group work outside of the class. This student in the green note has a speech impairment and needs a speech therapist. These students who are in the purple notes, they are all students whose primary language is Spanish, and they come from mostly Central American and Caribbean countries, and they come to the United States speaking Spanish as their first language. Now you see that in this case, they are all being assigned to one teacher. As we create this distribution of students, we're also being very thoughtful about how we're going to provide services from specialists. And we determined that if in these 3 classrooms, we needed those classroom teachers to collaborate with a special educator, we didn't want to also add a specialist for children who speak other languages. So we did put those children in one class, but we did not put any students who had obvious disabilities. So this is just to demonstrate how they were going about being very thoughtful about sharing students. And the next step would then be assigning the roles and relationships.
Okay, thank you, Carol. So then this next slide shows several examples of inclusive classrooms with collaborative teaching. The slide up top here shows 2 different teachers, a general educator, a regular educator, and a specialized teacher or tutor, working with small groups of students. This would have been pre-planned and predetermined between the teachers and for specific purpose. They may be targeting specific skills that these students were identified as needing, or they may be working on specific projects with those students in small groups. The picture below it shows another example of 2 teachers co-teaching in the same classroom where they are monitoring student work and working with all students simultaneously. So these 2 educators are working with every child in the class during this group work time when students are being a little more independent. The top right hand is a picture of 2 teachers planning to each together, maybe reviewing data to make decisions about how to group students the following day or week or in the following weeks to come. And the bottom picture is an example of a faculty meeting or a whole group of teachers who are divided up to make decisions about the learning in their classrooms and in their schools. This is also an example of how you could problem solve as a principal with multiple members of your staff or your team at the same time around specific concerns, questions, or training that they may need as it relates to the implementation of a co-teaching model or inclusive practices. So next, I'm going to discuss the role of the classroom teacher and specialized teacher in this type of model. These teachers need to work collaboratively or together, as we showed in the previous photo, to develop lessons that are multi-level, meaning that if you have a variety of learning needs in your classroom, you need to make very deliberate decisions about how you're going to deliver instruction to your students, what role each of you is going to take on any given day, how you're going to distribute the students, and how you are going to deliberately meet the needs of the students in the classroom. Before you can design these lessons, you need to look at data and assess how students learn, what their learning needs are, and what you may need to do to accommodate the lesson or develop materials that meet specific needs, and who is going to be responsible for developing those materials and for the implementation of different phases of the lesson. The two teachers both need to be communicating with families. So it shouldn't just be that the specialized teacher is the one communicating with the students with disabilities. Both teachers need to be completely involved with all students in the classroom. They should not be dividing students up in terms of responsibility. They should share responsibility of the learning for all students and be very deliberate about who's making contacts depending on what it is that they're going to be discussing with the family. For example, the specialized teacher may need to make a contact to a parent if it has something specific to do with a child's disability, that specialized teacher has the expertise to discuss with the family. However, the regular teacher or the general teacher in this setting might be the contact to the family to share a praise, something great that the student has accomplished in the class on a particular day, or to share some things that they are noticing that they feel that the parents or the family or the guardians need to understand. So the teachers need to collaborate and be very deliberate about how they're communicating. They need to co-teach together, and they need to identify which role each is going to take on a given day. And they also need to facilitate social interactions among students, meaning they may need to model for a student that has maybe a disability that causes them to have behavioral challenges, how they're going to model for that student, how they should behave in a particular setting or during a particular type of time during the lesson. And that should be shared responsibility between the two teachers, and they need to predetermine who is going to take on that role of, maybe we call them social stories, or modeling examples for students of how to behave in certain situations. And sometimes students with disabilities need that specific direction on how to appropriately socially interact. And again, the role of both teachers is to determine who is going to be responsible for that particular student on any given day. And then they need to work together to develop their behavior plan for their classroom. How is the classroom going to be set up? What will be the routines and rituals in that classroom? How will they model those routines for students? How will they be reinforced? And what kind of positive behavior system will be in place for rewarding students when they're following the model and the plan that the teachers have set forth?
Carolyn, before we go to the next slide, I just noticed something in this picture. For this student here, he has pictures and words. So for communication, what that is telling me is that he is a student who has some limitations in his verbal communication. I remember in one of your schools years ago when we visited an elementary school, you had several children who used communication systems because they were not strong verbally. They had autism. And what the school did was very impressive. Not only did those children have their own communication system, but every single class in the grades of those students had the picture symbols taped to a desk so that any child and every child in the class not only could use them, but would understand what all of those symbols meant. And it normalized the use of a different kind of communication system. Even in the hallways, I remember at child level, there were hallways that also had those pictures that communicated hallway behavior and other things that might commonly be communicated in the hallway. Again, it was normalizing different communication systems so that all children would be comfortable with it.
Yes, and the thing that also did was, and we say this a lot when we work through an inclusive model, is that benefited all students, because there are students who learn better visually, and having a different way to communicate, even if they are not a child with autism or a child with that may be nonverbal for some reason, they may have difficulty with language. And so those picture cues were helpful for them to communicate with others, as well as for them to communicate with their peers that did have communication issues. So the next couple of slides show some examples of co-teaching. This is an example of a teacher teaching a small group using some type of smart technology in the front of the room, as well as two other educators working individually with students which may or may not have disabilities. This young man looks like he may have Down syndrome and may need additional support from a tutor or a specialized teacher. And this student is getting some individualized support from an educator, while another teacher is working with a small group of students in the front of the room. This is another example of co-teaching. You see in this example, two educators pulling small groups. They would have predetermined during their planning what they were going to be doing in these small groups and who was responsible for what outcomes. And they would be discussing, following this lesson, how the work went in their small groups and how they should proceed going forward in the coming days, in terms of whether they're going to switch the groups, whether they're going to change the composition of the groups and maybe move certain students from one group to another because they may be in a different place depending on what the next outcomes for future lessons are. And so it's very important that ongoing conversation is happening outside of the instructional time between these educators as they move forward with continuing to group students. And then here again, we see teachers in a small setting, working with small groups of students, and again, very deliberate planning before these kinds of decisions can happen. So teachers need to have the time built into their schedule. Again, that's the principal's role, to identify ways for that to happen during the school day so that they can meaningfully plan, so that when it's time for them to be with students, they already know how they're going to group them and what the outcomes are for that day. You're muted, Carol.
Thank you. As we're coming to the ending messages of our presentation, we wanted to talk about what it means to be included. Some of the thinking in the United States is what I call inclusion confusion. And when I use the term confusion, I'm referring to the ways of thinking that some teachers have, that to be included is only to be physically present. I hope that what we've talked about is ways in which the adults are working together to create the instruction and the lessons that will embrace all children. But as we think about inclusion, beyond being in the physical classroom, there are three other really important ways to think about the idea of being included. And the first one is to have a sense of belonging. You can see on the faces of these children that they appear to be happy to be together, happy to be in that place with their peers who don't have disabilities. We know through research that when children are happy versus angry or sad, they're more open to learning. We know this to be true. We also have research that has looked at measures of a sense of belonging of college students and compared that with their academics, their grades, their post-college outcomes, their feelings of self-esteem, and other mental health concerns. And they have found over and over a high correlation between having a sense of belonging to success academically and emotionally. So one of the things we need to think about if we want our students with disabilities to be academically successful is to create an environment where they feel like a valued member of their class and of their school. They're called by their name and not by their disability label. That we actually think of them as if they belong, truly belong. They have a right to be there. And as we recognize their differences, we look at them as unique aspects to be valued and not disvalued. So we don't consider the disability as something wrong or something to be fixed, but rather a part of who they are, and recognize that we need to create an environment that accommodates for that disability. I don't know how that happened. So another part is meaningful participation, where we not only have the child in the classroom and we value them, but we look to create the learning activities that will be meaningful. This student is in a wheelchair. She has cerebral palsy. She has a button device that if you press it, it gives one or possibly two messages. That's used as a quick communication because she cannot speak. She also has a book, and you see the other children who are her peers at her grade level have chapter books. And this is a book that they are reading as part of their literature. She has the same book, but adapted for a lower intellectual level and with pictures and words that she is more likely to comprehend. So while the book is adapted, it's for the same content that all of the other children are reading. So we want to look at the discussions that we have for the whole group and always think about how can this child be included in that discussion in a meaningful way, even if it's just to ask one question or give one answer. We want to think about how we're arranging students. Carolyn pointed out in some of the previous pictures how a teacher may have students grouped in small groups one way on one day and may rearrange those students on another day. So being very thoughtful about why students are in a group and what we're doing with them when they're there and what our expectations are. We want to be flexible with that. We also want students as much as possible to transition to lunch or to other activities in the same way. I remember being in a high school where a student was taken with a tutor to a class, and she left one class ahead of all of the other students by the adult to another class. And then she arrived there early and she had to wait. And I asked her why, the adult, I said, why did you leave early? And she said, oh, she thought the hallways were too crowded. But if we think like that, we're not preparing that child for life. That child was capable of not only walking, but perhaps walking with a peer and being supported by that peer and feeling like a part of the whole group. We really do want to prepare peers to feel very comfortable with children who have disabilities, who may be their neighbors or their employees later on as they become adults. So we're not looking only at the academic instruction, but the other social activities and transitions within the school. And finally, as we think about what we are teaching, we want to begin with the grade level standards. I recall how we used to teach special education classes when we group students together with a disability in a special room with a special teacher. We often taught them based on that level that they currently performed. In other words, after they were assessed, we identified the next level skill that they needed, and we only taught that next level skill. But in an inclusive class, we want to do it differently. We want to start at the grade level and say, these are the expectations for all students, and determine what is the most important concept and how can we teach this student that concept. What are the most important vocabulary words? So we're beginning with the grade level expectations and then drilling down to the students' capabilities. And that will make for much richer instruction and better outcomes for that student. And so finally, in our presentation, we want to say that when we learn together, we are more likely to be able to live together. And we have adults showing their cooperation and collaboration. We have children learning together, and we are creating communities where we have, as adults, people with and without disabilities will be able to learn together. So in the last 9 minutes or so that we have, we'd be very happy to take your questions or consider any ideas or comments that you'd like to offer.
Carol and Caroline, at first, thank you. And the second, at the chat was one question about positive behavior.
I'm sorry, about what?
About positive behavior.
And what is the question?
If I understand right, it's what positive behavior about?
What do we mean by positive behavior? So positive behavior means that you are reinforcing when students are following the behavior model that you set up in the classroom, when they're following the rules. You're reinforcing and giving positive praise to students when they are following the rules that the teachers have decided, the rules, the rituals and routines that the teachers have established for the classroom. Carol, I don't know if you want to add on to that.
Exactly what Carolyn said, and it's also referring to a positive approach. So rather than think about behavior as needing discipline all of the time, we want to think about a prevention approach to behavior. So we minimize or lessen the need for a child to engage in negative behavior.
Ekaterina, Carol and Caroline, thank you. Ekaterina, was it your question? And if yes, say us, please. Did Caroline and Carol ask on a question, answer on a question. And if anyone have any questions, we can ask about that.
I do want to say, I see that Ekaterina is from Syktyvkar, and that was one of the cities that I went to in 2011 or 2012, and very glad to see you. It's cold up there. Yes, we have found not only through our personal examples, and Carolyn oversees several high schools that have included children with intellectual disability. We know from our personal examples that it makes a huge difference in the communication skills and academic skills, but we also have many research studies that have shown that children do better, not only during school, but they're more likely to have some employment opportunity after school. Carolyn, did you have any other things to add?
Yes, we include our students with significant intellectual disabilities in our high schools in my district. And we have found that we get much greater outcomes for those students as we transition them out of high school into post-high school opportunities for them to be involved with employment, to understand how to appropriately interact with others in a setting. And it really increases their outcomes as young adults. We educate students with significant intellectual disabilities until they are 21 years old. So we have them in school longer than the typical high school student. In the United States, typically high school students are finished at age 18. So we spend a lot of time with those students in transition to make certain that we have the greatest and most meaningful outcomes for them when they transition as young adults into their neighborhoods. And we have found much success with them being involved with their high school peers.
Thank you very much. From Italy.
Ah, hello. I've been there too, 2 or 3 times. Beautiful, beautiful city. Are there any other questions in the chat?
I don't see questions in the chat. I have one question, but it's not about. Can I go to Russian channel to say this? Чтобы не заставлять вас страдать, выслушивая мои попытки сказать по-английски. У меня следующий вопрос. Он, наверное, не касается напрямую темы выступления, хотя косвенно, мне кажется, все-таки он к ней относится. Я знаю просто, что Кэрол точно, Carolyn, возможно, вы тоже очень много коммуницируете и с разными школами, в том числе вот я знаю про поездку по России, по российским школам. И в этой связи мне было бы, наверное, интересно услышать, может, у вас есть какая-то вдохновляющая история о какой-нибудь школе или педагоге.
Yes, I do. Unfortunately, I do not know the name of the school, but there, I think someone from Perspectiva may know, or at least can find out. But there is a school in Moscow that I visited probably 6 years apart. And in the first time I went, they did have some children with disabilities, and the principal was working very closely with the teachers to think about how they could change their classroom instruction. And the challenge at that time, and I think in many Russian schools, is that you don't have a special educator position in the way that some European and countries and the United States and Canada have, where you have a special educator equally trained to the classroom or subject area teacher, and have that high level of special educator training. The defectologist, if they are actually instructional, they may be able to help, but the defectologists, at least at that time, were more assessment and diagnostic. But this administration, they were doing wonderful work. And when I went back about 6 years later, they had children with disabilities. They had done an amazing job of including children. There was another school that I went to in Moscow that was focused on including children with autism. And what I understood from that visit was they had, in that time, they had developed in Russia the tutor program, where tutors could receive 2 or more years of training specifically to teach children with disabilities. And so that school had focused primarily on children with autism, so their tutors had more specialty there. And they had created a sensory room for those students if they needed to take a break. What they were still working on was, when the tutor was with those students in the classroom, what was that relationship? And that is exactly the same problem of practice that many of our teachers have dealt with as they tried to figure out, how do we work together to make this not look like I'm a visitor, that I'm coming into your space, but rather we all belong here and we come in together. There was another, I don't know if Vlad is in here, and Vlad,
He's not here.
He's not here. Well, he took me to a school. It was about 45 minutes outside of Moscow, and they had renovated the school. They were focused on including children with physical disabilities. And they had renovated the school because many buildings, especially old buildings, have physical barriers. And they had looked at ways not only for the children to be able to physically access all of the environments, but how to adapt their recreation and physical education so that those students were equally valued and part of those sports and other activities. The 2 other examples, in Ulan-Ude in Buryatia Republic, they had a focus, this was quite a while ago, on preschool inclusion, and had some wonderful examples of 3- and 4-year-olds in a typical daycare preschool setting, and with children with different disabilities. And in Yekaterinburg, and I apologize for my pronunciation, at that time there was the Sun organization focused on promoting the inclusion of children with Down syndrome, and really doing wonderful work to try to educate the teachers and administrators in having kind of a change of mindset of how we could think about these children belonging. So I think one difference is because all of these schools were working very thoughtfully, is for schools to think about looking at the geography, at the neighborhood that they serve, and trying to find all of the students to bring them in so that there's not less focus on a disability and more on all children. But you have many examples in Russia where there's some really great work going on.
Thank you. Thank you. I have any Have we any question? I don't see any question from the chat. Oh. Nina, did you?
Carolyn, you might want to answer that.
Okay, yes, it is a challenge because what you don't want is for the device to be an over accommodation. So there is a real balance when you're talking about providing students with accommodations of any sort. And in this case, we're talking about students that need communication devices of some sort. If that device is not something that they can have with them at all times, it's not going to serve them well. So it's really important to transition to a communication system that the student can have access to 100% of the time. So what we find is if the technology isn't available in the home, that it's not good for the student to be reliant on that solely. So that's a first thing is this child going to have access to whatever the communication system is 100% of the time? And is it something that they can easily manage? Sometimes the iPad or the digital solution is too complex for the child, and they really do better with visual cues that may be handheld and maybe even paper with Velcroed pictures. So it really is very important to know your child and the way that they receive information the best. And if they're very distracted by things like a device, that may be one thing that they use, but maybe not the thing they use 100% of the time. And as the child gets older and more mature, they're typically able to handle the electronic solution better than they are when they're younger, if that
Carolyn,
makes sense.
Carolyn, what about if if her child has a learning disability and the teachers have identified using, say, an iPad with some kind of software that other children are not using, but in line with the academic content? What about that difference?
That's important too. So it's really ideal if whatever the device is that the child is using, that the other students know how to interact with that device. And it really depends on the level of technology that's required of the student, because some of those devices are very technical in nature, and it takes a lot of time and pre-planning for the teacher to preload vocabulary or preload statements, and then teaching the other students how to interact with that device. So you don't want to further separate your child from other children because they can't communicate. That's why that simple system that Carol described that we used in the one school, where it was in the hallways and it was in the learning stations and it was at each child's desk that all students were using to communicate with one another, that was not an electronic solution. That was a very basic kind of visual system. So it's difficult for me to answer completely without knowing your child, because it really is a very an individualized thing, and it can change as the child grows and matures in terms of what is overwhelming and not.
I think the question was not so much a communication system as alternative academic content. But just to the point of distraction, it's really up to the adults, because we have this question a lot around different expectations. Why does that student get to do something different? And the adults need to communicate that if a student needs something, it's because they need it. And if you need it, you could have it, but you don't need it. So our definition of being fair is getting what you need, and not everybody needs the same thing. I hope that was an answer, Nina. So Galina, I'm not sure if it looks like we're over time.
Да, у нас уже заканчивается время, подходит к концу. Я смотрю, что в чате больше вопросов нету. По-моему, да. И спасибо большое, Кэролайн, за такую интересную информацию. Я думаю, она будет полезна нашим слушателям, нашим участникам конференции. Спасибо большое вам, Нина, за перевод, а также всем слушателям, кто сегодня присоединился к нам и узнал что-то новое для себя. И в целом, может быть, даже будет делиться этой информацией с другими своими коллегами.
Thank you very much.
Знакомыми.
Thank you.
Thank you. До свидания.
До свидания.